Deep in the Cascade Mountains, an eccentric engineer spent 6 years carving a steel-reinforced vault into solid granite. Neighbors called him paranoid, but as a catastrophic avalanche swallowed his cabin whole, burying him under 60 feet of snow, that heavily mocked secret door became his only chance at survival. David Hensley was not a man who trusted the fragile comforts of modern civilization. For 30 years, he had worked as a senior structural engineer for Rio Tinto, designing subterranean reinforcements for deep-vein mining operations across the globe. He intimately understood how easily tons of earth, rock, and ice could crush steel and concrete if the mathematics were even slightly miscalculated. When he retired at 62, David didn't buy a beachfront condo in Florida. Instead, he purchased a 40-acre plot of rugged, off-grid timberland at the dead end of an old Weyerhaeuser logging road in Washington state's Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. To the locals in the nearby valley town of Glacier, David was a polite but peculiar recluse. His closest neighbor, a grizzled logger named Arthur Higgins, who lived 3 miles down the mountain, often joked that David was building a doomsday bunker. Arthur wasn't entirely wrong. David's home was a beautiful, reinforced A-frame cabin built right up against a sheer face of solid granite. But it was what lay behind the cabin that sparked rumors. During his first 2 summers on the mountain, David had brought up a Caterpillar D6 bulldozer and industrial diamond-tipped core drills. He spent months boring directly into the granite hillside at the rear of his basement. He told the county inspector he was building a traditional root cellar for off-grid food storage. But a standard root cellar does not require 6-inch thick AR-500 steel plating, the kind used in armored personnel carriers, shipped specifically from Pacific Steel and Recycling in Seattle. Nor does it require a custom-built airtight vault door secured by 6 titanium locking bolts. What nobody in town knew was that David had found a geographic anomaly. While reviewing historical geological survey maps from 1898, he discovered that his property sat directly in front of the abandoned Blackwood silver claim. The miners had blasted a horizontal shaft deep into the mountain, only to abandon it when the silver veins dried up. David hadn't just built a cellar. He had excavated his way into that forgotten 19th-century mine, connecting his home's reinforced basement to a labyrinth of subterranean tunnels. He reinforced the first 100 feet of the mine with heavy timber and steel arches, creating a massive, naturally climate-controlled bunker. At the threshold between his modern basement and the dark, ancient mine, he installed the vault door. He called it his insurance policy. In January of 2024, that policy came due. David's 28-year-old daughter, Chloe, had driven up from Seattle for a rare weekend visit. A corporate accountant who preferred the bustling city over the isolating wilderness, Chloe humored her father's eccentricities, even though she secretly agreed with the locals that his obsession with structural integrity bordered on clinical paranoia. She had parked her Subaru Outback next to his woodshed on a Friday afternoon. By Friday evening, the sky over the Cascades bruised into a terrifying, unnatural shade of violet. Down at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, headquarters in Seattle, senior meteorologist Dr. Richard Atwood was staring at his radar monitors in disbelief. An atmospheric river, carrying an unprecedented volume of moisture from the Pacific, was colliding violently with a freak Arctic low-pressure system dropping straight down from British Columbia. The local news stations began broadcasting emergency alerts, warning of historic snowfall, but out on the logging road, David's satellite internet had already cut out. The snow didn't just fall, it buried the landscape with aggressive, terrifying speed. By Saturday morning, the Weyerhaeuser Road was impassable. By Saturday night, the snow was accumulating at an astonishing rate of 10 inches per hour. The wind howled through the Douglas firs with a deafening roar, snapping century-old trees like dry twigs. Inside the cabin, the heavy wood-burning stove radiated heat. David and Chloe sat in the living room, listening to the relentless assault of the storm. The wind speeds reached 90 miles per hour, rattling even David's over-engineered windows. "It's just a storm, Dad," Chloe said. clutching a mug of tea, trying to mask her growing anxiety as the cabin groaned under the wind pressure. "It's not the wind I'm worried about, Chloe," David replied, his eyes fixed firmly on the ceiling. "It's the weight. There are already 10 feet of snow on the roof, and we are sitting at the bottom of a 40-degree incline." He was looking at the summit of Kulshan Ridge, towering 2,000 feet directly above their cabin. The ridge was a known avalanche zone, but in recorded history, a slide had never reached the lower timberline where David's cabin sat. But this was not a normal storm. The sheer mass of the snowpack was becoming structurally unstable. Millions of tons of dense, heavy snow were clinging to a steep, icy surface, held back by nothing but friction. At 2:14 a.m. on Sunday, that friction failed. It didn't sound like snow. It sounded like a freight train plummeting from the sky. Deep in her sleep, Chloe was jolted awake by a low, visceral vibration that rattled her teeth. The entire mountain seemed to be humming. Before she could process the sound, her bedroom door burst open. David was there, holding a high-powered tactical flashlight. "Basement! Now!" he roared. Chloe didn't ask questions. The urgency in her father's voice stripped away any lingering city-bred skepticism. She scrambled out of bed, her bare feet hitting the freezing hardwood floor. As they sprinted down the hallway, the sound grew exponentially louder, transforming from a rumble into a deafening, apocalyptic roar. The floorboards buckled beneath their feet. They reached the top of the basement stairs just as the shockwave hit. A Class 5 avalanche is a force of nature that defies human comprehension. It is a tidal wave of pulverized ice, uprooted trees, and shattered boulders traveling at over 130 miles per hour. When the wall of white death slammed into the A-frame cabin, the structure didn't just collapse, it atomized. The upper 2 stories of the house were sheared off the foundation instantly, reduced to a massive spray of splinters and glass that was carried hundreds of yards down the valley. David shoved Chloe down the concrete stairs, throwing his body over hers just as the main floor above them gave way. The reinforced concrete ceiling of the basement held for a fraction of a second, groaning under the sudden impact of 1,000,000 tons of snow, before partially buckling. A massive steel I-beam, installed by David years ago, screamed in metal fatigue but managed to catch the collapsing floor joists, creating a small, triangular void over the stairwell. Then came the darkness, followed immediately by absolute terrifying silence. Chloe lay curled on the cold concrete floor of the basement, gasping for air. Her lungs burned from the sudden inhalation of fine, powdery snow and pulverized drywall dust that hung thick in the pitch-black air. She felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. "Chloe, are you hurt?" David's voice was remarkably calm, though it echoed strangely in the confined space. "No," she coughed, waving the dust away from her face. "No, I'm okay." "What? What happened?" A click echoed in the dark, and a blinding beam of light sliced through the dust. David swept the tactical flashlight over their surroundings. The sight was paralyzing. The stairs they had just tumbled down led up to a solid ceiling of packed concrete hard snow, interspersed with jagged shards of Weyerhaeuser timber and twisted metal. The basement walls had held, thanks to the foot-thick poured concrete, but they were effectively entombed. There were no windows down here. The emergency LED backup lights flickered on, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the wreckage. "The cabin is gone," David said flatly. He walked over to the stairwell, pressing his hand against the wall of packed snow. "This isn't loose powder. The pressure of the avalanche has compacted this into ice. We are buried under at least 40 feet of it." Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced Chloe's chest. "We have to dig out. The shovels are in the corner. If we dig up, the snowpack will collapse and crush us," David explained, his engineering mind already calculating loads and structural physics. "Even if we could dig, we have about 6 hours of breathable oxygen left in this room before the carbon dioxide levels become lethal. We are in a sealed box." Chloe backed away, her breathing growing shallow. So we're dead. We're buried alive. David turned away from the collapsed stairs and shone his flashlight toward the far wall of the basement. There, nestled into the exposed granite, stood the massive, dark grey, Weyerhaeuser-grade steel vault door. "I didn't spend 6 years building a tomb, Chloe," David said, stepping toward the heavy wheel of the door. "I built a back door." For the first time since she was a teenager, Chloe looked at her father's paranoia, not with embarrassment, but with profound, desperate gratitude. The secret door into the mountain. David approached the steel door, entering a 5-digit code into the mechanical keypad before gripping the heavy iron wheel. He strained against it. For a terrifying second, it didn't budge. The geological trauma of the avalanche had shifted the foundation slightly. Gritting his teeth, David put his entire body weight into it. With a loud, metallic shriek that echoed off the concrete walls, the locking bolts disengaged. He pulled the heavy door open. A rush of stale, freezing air blew into the basement. It smelled of wet earth, oxidized iron, and deep, ancient stone. "Grab the emergency packs from the shelf," David ordered, shining his light into the cavernous black mouth of the tunnel. "We take the old mine shaft. It slopes upward and connects to a ventilation grate I installed near the upper ridge. We hike out through the mountain." Chloe quickly strapped on a heavy canvas survival bag, containing thermal blankets, rations, and spare lithium batteries. They stepped over the steel threshold, leaving the ruins of their home behind, and David pulled the heavy vault door shut. The click of the locking mechanism sounded horribly final. They were now inside the Blackwood Silver claim. The tunnel was wide, supported by massive, rotting timber beams from 1898, which David had reinforced with modern steel scaffolding. They walked in silence for 20 minutes, their flashlights cutting through the suffocating darkness. Chloe began to feel a glimmer of hope. They were going to make it. Her father had planned for everything, but the mountain had other plans. As they rounded a bend in the tunnel, anticipating the steady incline toward the ventilation shaft, David stopped dead in his tracks. The beam of his flashlight hit a solid, impenetrable wall of collapsed rock and twisted steel. The avalanche hadn't just destroyed the cabin. The millions of tons of force crashing down on the mountain's exterior had triggered a localized seismic shockwave. The roof of the old mine had completely caved in, blocking their only planned escape route. Chloe stared at the massive boulders blocking their path, the silence of the deep earth pressing against her eardrums. She turned to her father, watching the color drain from his face. "The main shaft is gone," David whispered, a tremor of genuine fear cracking his stoic facade for the first time. He shone his light to the left, where a narrow, unmapped offshoot tunnel plunged sharply downward, deep into the uncharted abyss of the 19th century mine, a section David had never explored, a section rumored to be flooded by an underground glacial river. "Dad," Chloe's voice trembled, echoing into the dark. "Where does that one go?" David swallowed hard, staring into the black void. Down. The descent was agonizingly steep. The unmapped offshoot of the black. Here, the granite walls were weeping with icy groundwater, and the floor was an uneven hazard of shattered quartz and century-old, decaying timber braces that looked ready to snap under the weight of a whisper. David took the lead, his heavy leather Dana boots finding precarious footholds on the slippery rock. Chloe followed close behind, the beam of her Petzl headlamp cutting nervously through the dense, freezing mist that hung in the air. The ambient temperature was plummeting the deeper they went. Above ground, the storm was raging at a bitter 10 degrees Fahrenheit, but down here, insulated by millions of tons of stone, the air hovered at a chilling 34 degrees. "Step exactly where I step," David instructed, his voice low, devoid of its usual booming authority. The reality of their situation was settling over him. He was a master of structural physics, but he was currently navigating a geological anomaly that had been abandoned by desperate silver miners in 1898 for a reason. As they rounded a sharp switchback, The sound of rushing water echoed up from the dark. It wasn't a trickle, it was a heavy, churning torrent. 10 minutes later, the tunnel abruptly leveled out, ending at the edge of a fast-moving subterranean river. The water was pitch black, violently cutting across the path and disappearing beneath a low-hanging arch of solid basalt. It was glacial runoff, fed by the deep aquifers of Kulshan Ridge. David knelt at the water's edge, sweeping his tactical flashlight across the surface. The beam barely penetrated the murky depths. 50 feet away, on the opposite bank, the tunnel continued upward, marked by the rusted remains of an old, narrow-gauge ore cart track. "We have to cross," David said, the beam of his light trembling slightly. "The tunnel picks up on the other side. Judging by the incline of those tracks, it leads toward an old exhaust adit. They use them to vent dynamite fumes out of the deep shafts." Chloe stared at the violent black water. "Dad, we don't know how deep it is. If we get wet in this temperature, we'll go into hypothermia in minutes. We don't have a fire." "I know the math, Chloe," David snapped, though the harshness in his voice was rooted entirely in fear for his daughter's life. He unbuckled his heavy canvas survival bag. "Water drains body heat 25 times faster than air. If we cross fully clothed, our garments will freeze to our skin the moment we step out. We cross naked, holding our gear above our heads. We dry off immediately with the thermal blankets, redress, and keep moving to generate body heat. It is the only thermodynamic variable we can control." It was a brutal, terrifying logic, but Chloe knew he was right. Standing in the suffocating darkness of the deep earth, modesty was a useless luxury. They stripped in frantic silence, packing their Gore-Tex jackets, boots, and base layers tightly into their waterproof bags. The freezing air immediately bit into Chloe's bare skin, raising violent goosebumps. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. "Stay behind me. Use the current to push you toward the bank. Don't fight it directly," David ordered, stepping into the water. He gasped as the glacial liquid hit his legs. It wasn't just cold, it was a physical assault. The water felt like thousands of burning needles piercing his flesh. Chloe followed, her breath leaving her lungs in a sharp, involuntary shriek as the water rose to her waist, then her chest. The current was deceptively strong, pulling at their legs, trying to drag them down into the submerged caverns below. David moved with slow, agonizing deliberation, feeling for solid footing on the slick riverbed. Halfway across, the water crested David's shoulders. Chloe, being shorter, was forced to tread water, kicking frantically with one arm while holding her heavy dry bag aloft with the other. Suddenly, David stumbled. His foot slipped on an algae-slicked boulder, and he plunged beneath the black surface. The tactical flashlight, strapped to his wrist, cast chaotic beams of light through the churning water. "Dad!" Chloe screamed, swallowing a mouthful of freezing metallic-tasting water. David broke the surface a second later, gasping violently, his face pale and contorted in agony. He scrambled toward the opposite bank, dragging himself out of the water and collapsing onto the rocky shore. Chloe followed, her limbs sluggish and unresponsive, her core temperature dropping to dangerous levels. She hauled herself out beside him, immediately tearing into her dry bag with numb, uncoordinated fingers. She pulled out the foil thermal blankets, throwing one over her father, who was clutching his right thigh. In the harsh light of the headlamp, Chloe saw the water pooling beneath him, turning a dark, sickly crimson. When he had slipped, his leg had struck a submerged, rusted iron rail spike left behind by the 1898 miners. It had torn a deep, jagged 6-inch laceration across his quadriceps. "Tourniquet," David managed to whisper, his teeth clicking together violently. In the first aid kit, high and tight, panic threatened to consume Chloe, but the clinical, almost detached tone of her father's command grounded her. She wasn't an accountant right now. She was a mechanism of survival. She ripped open the medical kit, retrieved the nylon tourniquet, and slid it up her father's pale, shivering leg, twisting the windlass rod until the bleeding slowed to a sluggish weep. They dried off with agonizing speed, pulling their dry base layers and heavy jackets back on. But the damage was done. David had lost blood, and his core temperature had taken a massive hit. As he tried to stand, his leg buckled. The engineer, the man who had prepared for every structural failure, had suffered a critical mechanical breakdown of his own. "I can't walk it, Chloe," David panted, leaning heavily against the granite wall, sweat mixing with the freezing river water on his forehead. "The muscle fascia is torn. You have to leave me. Take the bag. Follow the tracks up. When you get out, call Arthur Higgins. He knows the ridge." Chloe looked at her father, a man who had spent his life building fortresses to keep the world out, now resigning himself to die in one. "No," Chloe said. Her voice didn't shake. The city-bred anxiety had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve forged in the darkest corner of the earth. She stepped under his left arm, hoisting his heavy frame onto her shoulder. "We are not doing the dramatic goodbye down here. You built the door, but I'm going to walk you through it." Time lost its meaning in the Blackwood silver claim. Hours bled into an endless, agonizing cycle of lifting, stepping, and dragging. Chloe essentially carried her father up the steep, 30-degree incline of the exhaust adit. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. The oxygen was growing terrifyingly thin, thick with the scent of ancient dust and the metallic tang of David's blood. He was fading in and out of consciousness, muttering deliriously about load-bearing vectors and titanium bolts. Her muscles burned with lactic acid, her lungs screaming for clean air. The heavy canvas bag dug painfully into her shoulders, but she refused to stop. The tunnel grew narrower, the timber supports disappearing entirely, replaced by a smooth vertical chimney of raw limestone that intersected the granite, a natural geological vent. At the top of the chimney, roughly 30 feet above them, Chloe saw something that made her heart stop. It wasn't darkness. It was a pale, muted grey. "Dad!" she gasped, gently lowering him to the stone floor. "Dad, look! It's the surface." David blinked, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He looked up the vertical shaft. Avalanche debris, packed in the opening. "It's blocked." He was right. The pale grey wasn't the sky. It was a solid plug of ice, snow, and shattered timber wedged firmly into the top of the vent. The storm had sealed the mountain's only exhaust pipe. "It's just snow," Chloe said, unzipping the survival bag one last time. She pulled out the collapsible aluminum avalanche shovel and a pair of black diamond mechanical ascenders. "I can dig through it. Physics, Chloe." David whispered weakly, coughing dryly. "If you dig from below, the plug will collapse inward. It will crush you. Tens of thousands of pounds of static load." "Then I'll dig fast," she replied. Leaving her exhausted father at the base of the chimney, Chloe clipped the ascenders onto an old, heavily oxidized chain that dangled from the rock face, a relic used by miners to haul equipment up the vent. Praying the rusted iron would hold her weight, she ratcheted herself up the 30-foot vertical shaft, hanging suspended just inches beneath the massive plug of frozen snow. She extended the handle of the aluminum shovel. There was no room for sweeping motions. She had to chip away at the ice above her, letting the freezing debris rain down onto her face and shoulders. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of metal striking ice echoed down the chimney. It was agonizingly slow work. Her arms felt like lead, and the freezing runoff soaked her clothes. Above her, the massive plug of snow began to groan ominously. David was right. The structural integrity of the ice was failing as she carved out its center. A massive block of ice dislodged, striking her left shoulder and nearly knocking her off the ascenders. She screamed in pain, her grip faltering, but the mechanical teeth of the ascender bit into the chain, holding her suspended. Through the pain, she noticed something. The air pouring through the hole she had just created wasn't stale. It was razor-sharp, freezing, and tasted like pine needles. She drove the shovel upward with everything she had left. The crust shattered. A blinding, violent shaft of pure, unfiltered sunlight violently pierced the darkness, hitting Chloe's face like a physical blow. The storm was over. She frantically clawed at the edges of the hole, widening the aperture until she could pull her head and shoulders through the crust of the snowpack. The world above was unrecognizable. The rugged timber-covered valley had been transformed into a smooth alien landscape of blinding white. The entire side of Kulshan Ridge had been scoured clean, but the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Chloe dragged herself entirely out of the hole, collapsing onto the frozen surface of the snowpack. She lay there for a minute, simply breathing, letting the freezing air fill her lungs. Then, she unclipped a bright orange emergency beacon from her Gore-Tex jacket, pulled the activation pin, and hurled it into the open expanse. Down in the valley, Arthur Higgins had spent the last 2 days staring through his binoculars at the scarred, devastated face of the mountain where David's cabin used to be. He had already called King County Search and Rescue, but he had told the dispatcher it was a body recovery mission. Nobody survived a Class 5 slide. At 1:15 p.m. on Tuesday, the GPS distress signal lit up the boards at the Rescue Coordination Center in Seattle. 45 minutes later, the heavy thwack, thwack, thwack of a Bell 412 helicopter cut through the silent mountain air. The rescue jumpers found Chloe sitting at the edge of the snow hole, her hands bloody and blistered, holding a climbing rope taut. Below her, secured by a makeshift harness, David Hensley was unconscious, but alive. When they finally hoisted David into the cabin of the helicopter, the lead medic immediately began administering warm fluids and packing his wounded leg. The medic looked at Chloe, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, staring blankly out the window at the ruins of her father's property. "How did you survive that slide?" the medic yelled, over the roar of the rotors. "There's nothing left down there." Chloe looked away from the window, her eyes locking onto the medic's. The city accountant was gone. In her place was a survivor, forged in the crushing, abyssal dark of the earth. "We didn't survive the slide," Chloe replied, her voice steady and hollow. "We survived the mountain." If this story of raw survival and human resilience kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a true thriller. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life survival stories and gripping historical dramas. Drop a comment below, would you have trusted the secret door? Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload.